As a script doctor, what do you see most screenwriters get wrong with the second act of their screenplays?
In the second act, I think that most writers sort of forget to keep surprising the audience. They write this killer first act, where maybe the first 3 pages are really engaging, the inciting incident is great, but then the story just becomes this lull. And they're kind of just making us wait to act 3 where they'll deliver all of the big things again. They sort of forget that act 2 is kind of the bulk of your story. That central conflict should be in motion. So they tend to kind of forget that they should be tracking the protagonist's arc through that. A lot of times, one of the things I see is that they do set up the protagonist well in Act 1, right? They set up their core wound, they flaw, we know what they need to overcome, but then we don't actually see the evolution of that in Act 2. We just see a change in Act 3 that kind of suddenly happens because, it needed to happen because it was set up. That's what Act 2 should be about. We should be seeing that central conflict evolve. We should see ups and downs in that emotional journey. The midpoint should throw us in a different direction and help us see the growth in the character. Help us see that change that will happen. If we're talking about Juno, for example, she has this ups and downs when she's talking about whether she should keep the baby or not. And Act 2 is really good because she goes into the subplot, with the potential adoptive father, that they start bonding and they have this kind of friendship where the adopted dad kind of starts resembling Juno. If you pay attention to the little details, he starts dressing more and more like her, which is a brilliant thing that they did in the movie. The costume department was great about that. So they implement that. That's one of the things in the second act that you should always bring into things, that subplot. That kind of revives the story after the midpoint, because that's one of the problems with Act 2, right? We always say that Act 2 is where things get kind of lull and boring because it's kind of long. So you should bring new things into the mix. If you're thinking about Back to the Future, for example, after the midpoint, where all of the excitement is about getting back to the future and everything happening, we get the subplot of the parents, right? He needs to get his parents back together or he won't exist in present time. So that's where things get interesting with kind of an outside story, which is the parents, this love subplot of bringing them together at the dance and everything. And that's what you should be giving to your story. But at the same time, that subplot still reflects on his emotional arc. We are not forgetting about it. He still needs to grow and understand, because part of his core wound in Back to the Future is that Marty is kind of fed up with his family and doesn't like what he has. He's bored. He doesn't get it. He needs to kind of fall in love again with his parents and the relationship they have. And he does that through helping them fall in love in the past. So he'll exist in the future, but then when he actually gets back to the future, in the resolution of that movie, we get that his family has kind of improved, right? The relationship with the parents and everything is much better because he played a part in that past. But that's the beauty of it. We're still tracking his arc, even through that subplot. He's still growing and evolving, so we see that change in him at the end.
Act 2 in a movie would be different than Act 2 in a TV series?
Yes. Well, it depends on what you're thinking. If you're thinking of a half-hour or an hour-long show, right? Usually, hour-long shows have a teaser and 5 acts, and a half-hour show has a teaser and 3 acts. So they're kind of structured a little different. And yes, obviously we have streaming these days where we don't technically see acts because we don't see commercial breaks, but I believe that writers should still kind of be writing with that concept in mind, whether they put that on the page or not, because that helps you track the emotional arc. So I always say that when you're analyzing television and when you're writing a pilot, whether you keep the act breaks or not on the page, which you can or can't do, whatever you decide, every act out should map your protagonist's emotional arc. So you should always end an arc on your protagonist and tracking that arc. So if you're thinking about a pilot, you're tracking how, let's say Breaking Bad, you're tracking Walter's journey into becoming whoever he's going to become, right? So the different act breaks in Breaking Bad would relate to, finding out he has cancer and then deciding he's going to reach out to Jesse Pinkman and things like that, always tracking him and that arc and change that they're doing. So in that sense, if you're kind of like trying to compare the arc of TV versus the acts on TV versus the acts on features, sort of like the problem of Act 2 that you see in a feature compared to television would be either Act 2 in a half hour or Acts kind of like 3 in like an hour-long show, which is kind of like in the middle where you're like, oh, where are things going? I'm showing like the subplots. That's where you should introduce really your subplots and your secondary characters, because in television, your supporting cast is really important because they're still part of the core cast of your show. So in a pilot, obviously, you try to focus more on your protagonist because that's really who the story is about. And then maybe in future episodes, you'll focus more on the other characters, but you should still introduce all of that in the pilot. And it's sort of like in the middle where you should bring them in and kind of start showing like the B, C, or D stories with them and all of the subplots to really lighten things up when things are getting, like, oh my God, we're getting a little bored about this like main story of the protagonist. Let's bring in the supporting cast and reflect the same themes or things that they're going through them and help them see where they're going.
And so is that something you spend the most time with a lot of new writers, is working on that second act?
Yes, that's a lot of the work, I would say, especially, tracking that arc, tracking the protagonist, showing that they need to be tracking things and not just expect a sudden change at the end. Let's say this morning I was working on a script for a writer and I was writing my notes and everything, and they have a great setup for what they want the character to do. It's a coming of age story. So usually, the teenager has to grow and learn something because something happens to them, right? They could be injured or they could have a heartbreak or whatever by the end. But then Act 2 kind of doesn't show us any of that growth. What you want is to track all of that. So give us a little journey. Show us why we should be watching this and how that ending is going to come. So for example, if you have someone that needs to overcome a stutter, track that through Act 2 before they have, the big speech that they might give in Act 3 where they're not stuttering anymore. So show us all of the obstacles they have to face. Perhaps they fall for someone and that makes them, stutter even more. Or then they get another obstacle in the way because they have to do a presentation. They're set up for a project at school and they're like, how am I going to do that? I won't be able to present. And then my crush is going to be watching me. It's going to be even worse. So give us those tidbits that keep tracking that arc when you're setting up, those subplots of the love story. And how am I going to handle that if I'm looking at a person that makes me stutter even more? And then set up that they have to do a project, because then by the end, we're expecting that. We're expecting that the prom is coming or the project, they have to give a speech or something like that. Tease that so we know that they're working towards something and we're tracking that evolution.